By every measure of common sense, she should have locked that door, turned off the lights, and called someone. She was 73 years old, 5'2", and completely alone. And standing on her porch were 15 members of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in American history. But she didn't lock that door. She opened it wider. What those men found inside changed them. What they did next changed her entire town. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, Tennessee, Montana, Florida, California, wherever you are tonight, I want to know. Because the kind of people who stop for a story like this one, they come from everywhere. And I have a feeling the comments on this video are going to prove that. And if you're someone who believes that kindness still matters in this world, that decency hasn't gone out of style no matter what the news tries to tell you, hit that like button right now, before we even begin. Because what this woman did on one February night in a snowstorm is going to remind you of something you already know, but maybe needed to hear again. Stay with me, because this is the kind of story that doesn't come around very often. The kind that starts with a blizzard and 15 Hell's Angels and one old woman standing at her door, and ends with something that will sit with you long after this video is over. This is Dorothy's story. And it begins the way all the best ones do, quietly, in a small town, on an ordinary day that had absolutely no idea what it was about to become. There are nights that don't announce themselves. No warning in the morning sky. No feeling in your chest when you wake up that says, pay attention today. Today will matter. They arrive quietly, wrapped in ordinary hours, disguised as just another Tuesday, just another February, just another evening where nothing of consequence was supposed to happen. This was one of those nights. And by the time it was over, by the time the sun came back up and the snow stopped and the world went still and white and clean, a woman named Dorothy had changed the lives of 15 men. And 15 men had changed hers. And an entire town had been forced to look at itself in a mirror it didn't know was there. This is that story. Stay with me. Every word of it matters. There is a particular kind of American town that doesn't exist on maps the way it exists in memory. You know the kind. You may have grown up in one, or driven through one on a long highway in summer with the windows down and thought, I could stop here. I could live here. The kind of town where the barbershop still has a pole that spins, where the diner on Main Street has been run by the same family for 3 generations, where the church marquee out front has been missing the letter E since 2014 and nobody has gotten around to fixing it. And at this point, it's almost a landmark. The kind of town where people wave from their porches, where casseroles still appear on doorsteps when someone passes away, where the high school football team losing in the playoffs is the kind of news that gets discussed at the hardware store for the better part of 2 weeks. It was that kind of town. Quiet. Decent, rooted in something older than the internet, older than cable news, older than the particular brand of suspicion that seems to have seeped into American life in recent years like groundwater through a cracked foundation. People here knew each other. They had for decades. And with that knowing came a certain understanding, unspoken, never written down, never needing to be, about how things worked. You looked after your own street. You kept your yard tidy. You nodded at the people you recognized, and you were politely reserved around the ones you didn't. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even conscious. It was just the grammar of a small town that had never been asked to stretch very far outside its own comfortable edges. This town had one unspoken rule. You kept to your own kind, and everybody followed it. Until that February. The month had been cold in the quiet, grinding way that February in this part of the country always manages to be. Not dramatic, not the kind of cold that makes the news, just the kind that settles into your joints and reminds you that you aren't as young as you used to be. The kind of cold that makes the drive to the grocery store feel like a minor expedition and makes the couch in the evening feel like the most reasonable place in the world to be. But the town moved through it, the way small towns always do. The diner stayed open. The hardware store kept its hours. The church with the broken marquee held its Wednesday night supper. And life, in the particular unhurried rhythm that defines these places, continued. There was nothing to suggest that anything was about to change. And then there was Dorothy. Dorothy had lived in her house for 47 years. She'd moved in as a young bride, 26 years old, with more hope than furniture and a husband who could fix anything with a set of tools and a little patience. The house was modest. 3 bedrooms, a porch that needed repainting every few years, a kitchen that smelled of bread on Tuesdays because that was the day Dorothy baked, and had been baking since before most of the neighbors on her street were born. She was 73 now, widowed. Her daughter lived 2 states away and called every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, which Dorothy appreciated, even if she sometimes found herself assuring her daughter that she was fine with a firmness that was more reflex than frustration. She drove herself to the grocery store. She fed the birds every morning, a congregation of sparrows and one particularly demanding cardinal who had staked out the feeder on the left and would not be moved. She kept her garden in summer, served on the altar guild at the church with the broken sign, and could tell you without hesitation what was wrong with any recipe that called for margarine instead of butter. Dorothy was not fragile. That is the first and most important thing to understand about her. She was weathered. There is a difference, and it matters. Fragile things break under pressure. Weathered things have already survived pressure and come out the other side with their shape intact, maybe worn a little smooth, maybe carrying the marks of everything that has passed over them, but standing. Always standing. She had buried a husband. She had raised a daughter mostly alone through the hard years after Harold came home from Korea with something behind his eyes that never fully left. She had kept this house, and this life, and this particular stubborn thread of decency running through everything she did. Kept it through decades that had not always been easy, through a world that had changed so completely around her that sometimes she barely recognized it. But some things about Dorothy had not changed at all. Harold had given her a saying, early in their marriage, during one of those conversations that young couples have when they're still making sense of each other and the world. He'd said it simply, the way Harold said most things, without flourish, without performance, the way a man says something he actually believes rather than something he wants to sound like he believes. A closed door is a closed heart. He'd meant it about people, about the instinct to shut yourself away from whatever made you uncertain or uncomfortable. He'd seen enough in Korea to know that the division between us and them was a human invention, paper-thin and destructive. He'd come home changed in some ways, yes, but also, in this particular way, clarified. Simplified down to something he could carry for the rest of his life. Dorothy had carried it after him. She baked bread on Tuesdays. She fed the cardinal who would not share his feeder. She kept Harold's photograph on the mantel. Young, in uniform, that particular expression he had where he looked both serious and on the verge of a joke. And she talked to him sometimes, the way long-married people continue to talk to the people they have lost, because the conversation never really ends. If you told Dorothy that morning, over her first cup of coffee, what would happen before midnight, she'd have set down her mug, looked at you steadily, and told you that you were out of your mind. But then again, Dorothy had never been one to turn away from crazy. The National Weather Service had called for light flurries. They were wrong. The storm came in from the northwest in the mid-afternoon, which was already an hour earlier than the forecast had suggested, and it came in not with the polite, incremental accumulation of a light flurry but with the sudden, committed intensity of weather that has somewhere to be and intends to get there. By 3 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees. By 4, the first roads were glazing over with the particular treacherous sheen of ice that forms not from snow but from freezing rain that arrives first, quiet and almost invisible, and lays down a surface that tires cannot find purchase on. People who had planned to run errands after work decided not to. Schools sent their buses out early. The diner on Main Street turned its open sign to closed for only the second time in 19 years. The first being the blizzard of 2008, which the town still referenced as a benchmark for serious weather. This was going to be worse than 2008. Dorothy had noticed the sky changing in the early afternoon, that particular flattening of the light, the way the clouds came in not like clouds, but like a ceiling being lowered, pressing down until the whole world felt compressed and gray. She'd gone to the back porch to bring in the bird feeders. No point making the sparrows work for it in weather like this, and she'd felt the cold change quality. It had teeth now. She went inside. She put on an extra pot of coffee. She turned on the lamp by the window, because outside was growing dark faster than it should, and the amber light of the lamp against the gray afternoon was one of those small domestic comforts that Dorothy had always known how to provide for herself. She didn't know then that the lamp would matter. That the light in her window, visible from the street, would be the first thing a certain group of men would orient themselves toward when everything else had gone to white. She had no way of knowing. 14 miles east of town, on a stretch of highway that cuts through open farmland with no shelter and no exits for a long and unforgiving run, A convoy of 15 motorcycles was in serious trouble. They were Hell's Angels, a chapter from the region, heading home from a rally 3 states over. 15 men, experienced riders, all of them. The kind of men who did not take to the road without knowing what they were doing, who read weather the way sailors read water, who had logged enough miles between them to circle the earth several times over. They had leather cuts, road-worn and patched with the particular insignia that made people on the sidewalks of ordinary towns tighten their expressions and cross to the other side of the street. Their bikes were not toys. They were serious machines, maintained with the kind of obsessive attention that the people who love motorcycles will understand immediately, and everyone else will simply have to take on faith. These men were not reckless. They were not careless. They were, by most measures that mattered on the open road, exactly the kind of riders you would want beside you if things went wrong. Things were going wrong. The highway had offered no warning. One stretch of road was manageable. Cold, yes, the wind coming across the flat farmland at an angle that pushed at you, but manageable. And then, in the space of less than a mile, the world had closed. The visibility dropped to almost nothing. The road surface changed beneath their tires in a way that communicated itself instantly, through the handlebars, through the seat, through every instinct that 15 years of riding had built into a man's body. This is not safe. This is not manageable. This has crossed a line. The road captain's name was Vince. He was the one who had been watching the sky. For the past 20 minutes, even before the visibility dropped, Vince had been watching the northwest horizon with the focused, slightly narrowed attention of a man who has learned to read landscapes the hard way. He'd seen weather like this once before. In 2009, on a stretch of highway not unlike this one, he'd watched his friend, a man who had ridden with him for 9 years, a man who knew the road as well as any of them, lose control on a patch of black ice and go down in a way that there was no coming back from. Vince had not spoken about that night in years, but he carried it, the way riders carry the losses, quietly, in the body, in the way his eyes went to the sky before they went to the road. He was not going to let something like that happen again, not on his watch, not to any of these men. He made the call. Off the highway. Now, get off the highway and find shelter and wait this out like intelligent human beings, because the alternative was a 14-mile run through a whiteout on ice-covered asphalt, and Vince had not come this far in life to make that kind of choice. They took the next exit. It brought them onto a Tulane County road, and the Tulane County road, half a mile further, brought them to the edge of a small residential neighborhood. Quiet, modest houses set back from the street, porch lights starting to come on in the gathering dark, the ordinary warm geometry of an American suburb in winter, exactly the kind of place that 15 Hells Angels had precisely zero business appearing in. But they were cold, and the road was dangerous, and Vince had made the call. You take the shelter you can find, not the shelter you'd prefer. Dorothy heard them before she saw them. She was in her kitchen, standing at the counter with her second cup of coffee and the particular unhurried contentment of a woman who has been alone long enough that she has made her peace with the quiet, made it more than a peace, actually, made it something closer to a preference. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was on in the living room. The wind was pressing against the windows in the way that wind does when it is serious about what it is doing. And then she heard it. She thought it was thunder at first. That low, rolling, directional sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it was too consistent for thunder, too rhythmic, too sustained. It was getting louder, coming from the street. She went to the kitchen window and looked out. She could see them through the falling snow, shapes, mostly, in the reduced visibility. Big shapes, moving slowly. Pulling to the curb in a line that stretched further than made sense at first, because her brain was not prepared to process 15 motorcycles on her street in a February blizzard, and so it tried several other explanations first before arriving at the obvious one. The engines cut, one by one, and in the silence that followed. A silence that was somehow louder and more complete than the engine noise had been, because the brain notices the removal of a thing more acutely than it notices the presence. Dorothy stood at her kitchen window and looked at 15 dark shapes standing on her street in the snow. Then she heard it again. Not engines this time. A knock on her door. She set down her coffee. She walked to the front door. She was not afraid. Or rather, she was something more interesting than afraid, which is to say she was alert. She was present. She was bringing to this moment the full weight of 73 years of knowing how to read a situation. And what she read, In that particular knock, not aggressive, not demanding, careful, almost tentative, was not danger. She did not know that 3 of her neighbors, watching from their windows, had already dialed 911. She reached for the handle. Vince was standing on her porch. He was 6'2", and he took up the kind of space that men of his size and history and intention take up. Significant space, space that you were aware of, space that you made a decision about. His cut was dark with melted snow across the shoulders. His beard had frost in it. His eyes, which were the pale, steady eyes of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors, were looking at Dorothy with an expression that she would describe later. To her daughter, on that Sunday morning phone call, as careful, as if he was trying very hard not to frighten her and knew, at some level, that the odds were not entirely in his favor. He did not say much. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. We've got 15 men and we need to get off the road. We won't be any trouble." That was all. Dorothy looked at him. She took in the patches on his cut, the frost in his beard, the careful, watchful expression on a face that had clearly spent decades not being careful or watchful in very comfortable circumstances. She looked past him at the others. Standing at the edge of her porch steps, in the street, big men made small by the white falling around them, standing in the particular posture of men who are waiting for a door to be shut in their faces and have accepted that this is probably what is going to happen. She thought about Harold. She thought about the saying he had given her, early in their marriage, that she had carried like a river stone in her pocket for 47 years, smooth and worn and solid in the hand. She looked at Vince again, and she said, in the ordinary, matter-of-fact voice of a woman stating something that she believes so completely it barely qualifies as a decision, "Harold always said a closed door is a closed heart, coming out of the cold." And she stepped back, and she opened the door wider. And Vince stood on her porch for one moment that he would later describe as the longest moment he could remember, and then he nodded once, turned to the men behind him, and said a single word. And 15 Hell's Angels walked into Dorothy's living room. That is where this story really begins. Dorothy made coffee first. This was not a decision so much as a reflex, the kind of thing that a woman of her generation does when people appear in her home in need of something. You make coffee, because whatever the situation, coffee is a start. Coffee is a gesture that means you are here, and I am acknowledging that you are here, and we will figure out the rest in a moment. The living room was not large. 15 men filled it in a way that should have felt overwhelming and somehow didn't, or didn't exactly. It felt instead like the room had been asked to do something it hadn't done in a long time, which was hold people, real people, warm bodies and road-worn voices, and the particular smell of cold air that clings to those who have been outside in winter. They were careful with her furniture. That was the first thing Dorothy noticed. They were careful. They moved around the room with a deliberate attention to the space they were taking up, to the objects on the shelves, to the photographs on the mantel. These were not men who did not know how to be somewhere without breaking it. She came back with the coffee. Then she made soup, because soup made sense. They had been in the cold for a long time, and soup was warm and filling and required nothing of the people eating it except the small vulnerability of allowing someone to feed them. Then she made sandwiches, because when she asked Vince if anyone was hungry, and he said, with what she could tell was practiced restraint, "We don't want to put you out," she said simply, "That's what you do when people are cold. Now sit down." And they sat down. And slowly, in the particular way that warmth and food and the cessation of danger will work on human beings regardless of who they are or where they come from, the 15 men in Dorothy's living room began to be people rather than silhouettes, began to be individuals, with faces and voices and the small gestures that distinguish one human being from another. Vince was the last to sit. He positioned himself near the window, where he could see the street. Old instinct, the road captain's instinct, never fully off duty. He watched Dorothy move around her kitchen with an expression that, if you had to name it, you might call reverence, though he would have denied it if you said so out loud. He was a man who was skeptical by temperament and training, skeptical of comfort and ease and the idea that things would simply work out. But there was something about Dorothy moving in her kitchen. The competence of it, the lack of performance, the simple self-possession of a woman doing what she had always done, that settled something in him he had not known needed settling. Walt was 67, the oldest in the group by several years. He had the particular economy of movement that men develop when they have lived in their bodies a long time and learned to conserve. He had sat down in the armchair nearest the fireplace. Dorothy had lit it, because she kept wood in, always. And he had been quiet for a long time, just looking around the room. Then his eyes had found the photograph on the mantel. Harold, young, in uniform. That expression that Dorothy had described to her daughter 100 times, serious and almost amused, and something else that didn't have an easy name. Walt looked at the photograph for a long time without saying anything. Rudy was the youngest. 26, perhaps. He had the slightly too alert quality of young men in situations they are not entirely sure how to read, but his instincts were good. He had gotten up without being asked when Dorothy came back from the kitchen with too many mugs to carry easily, and he had taken half of them from her, and found places for them on the coffee table, and said "Thank you, ma'am" in a voice that came out quieter and younger than he probably intended. Dorothy had looked at him and seen, the way old women see these things, that he had been raised right somewhere, and the road had added things to him, but not removed that. After a while, she brought out Harold's photo albums. She hadn't planned to. She had gone to the bookshelf for something else, and the albums were there, where they always were, the spines worn from 40 years of looking, and she had picked one up the way you pick up something that is part of your hand, and she had brought it back to the living room and opened it on the coffee table, and they gathered around it. She told them about Korea, about Harold. Not the man who had come back, exactly, but the man who had gone, the 22-year-old from this town with the tools in his hands and the joke behind his eyes who had believed, in that particular uncomplicated American way of young men in that era, that what he was doing mattered. She told them about the letters he had written. Careful letters, not dramatic, full of observations about the landscape and the food and the other men in his unit, always asking about the town, about her, about the particular details of ordinary life that he was apparently carrying with him as a kind of ballast against everything that ordinary life was not. The room was quiet while she talked. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people waiting for something to be over, but the alert, attending quiet of people being given something. And then Walt spoke. He said, in the voice of a man who has been sitting with something for a while and has decided it is time to say it, "My father served." 2 words. 3, counting my. And they landed in the room like something solid, like something that had weight and dimension and changed the shape of the air around it. Dorothy looked at him. Walt looked at the photograph of Harold on the mantel, and the last of the distance in the room. The last thin membrane of us in them that had been holding on since 15 men walked through a door into a stranger's living room, dissolved. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just dissolved, the way ice dissolves in warm water, quietly and completely, and without the possibility of going back. Vince was listening to Dorothy talk about Harold's unit. The dates she mentioned, the regiment, the particular actions she described in the way that wives of veterans describe them, imperfectly, with gaps that the veterans themselves had left unfilled. He was listening, and he was doing something else at the same time, something quiet and private that nobody in the room noticed. He was doing the math, the dates, the unit, the region. He let it sit. He let it settle. He didn't say anything yet. He would need to make some calls first. He would need to be sure. But something was turning over in him, slow and enormous, like a wheel that has been resting for a long time and has just been given the slightest push. He didn't know, yet, what it would mean. Across the street, while Dorothy showed Harold's photographs to 15 men who were quietly becoming something other than what the neighborhood had decided they were, a different story was unfolding. The neighborhood had been watching since the convoy pulled in. Curtains that had moved when the bikes arrived had not gone back to their original positions. Faces at windows, careful and still, processing what they were seeing with the particular mixture of fear and certainty that comes from having already decided what something means before you've gathered enough information to actually know. The neighborhood Facebook group had been active for some time. There was a man, a neighbor who lived directly across the street from Dorothy. A man of late middle age who had strong opinions about property values and parking and the appropriate use of shared green spaces. A man who believed, genuinely and without self-awareness, that his fear was the same thing as caution and his caution was the same thing as responsibility, who had posted first. Just a statement of what he'd seen. 15 motorcycles. Hell's Angels. Dorothy's house. The comments came fast. That woman has lost her mind. Someone else. She's going to get us all killed. Another, someone needs to call her daughter. The thread grew with the particular velocity of group fear, the way alarm moves through a closed network and amplifies itself with each pass. each commenter adding their weight to a story that was already being written before anyone had any of the actual facts. The man across the street called the police. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes after the bikes had pulled in. They knocked on Dorothy's door. Dorothy opened it. She stood in her doorway, a 73-year-old woman in a cardigan, holding a dish towel she'd been using in the kitchen, looking at 2 uniformed officers with an expression of polite, complete composure. Behind her, visible in the warm light of the living room, were 15 very large men in leather, several of whom had cups of coffee in their hands. The officer in front, young, trying to find the right approach, said, "Ma'am, we received some calls. We just wanted to make sure everything was." Dorothy said, "They're my guests, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer looked at her, looked past her at the room, looked back at her. There were no grounds. There was no distress. There was no crime in progress, visible, audible, or reasonably inferable. There was a woman in her home with people she had invited in, and the law, whatever the neighborhood's feelings on the matter, had precisely nothing to say about that. The officers left. Dorothy closed the door, returned to the kitchen, and thought nothing more about it. In the living room, Vince had watched the brief exchange at the door from his position near the window. He said nothing. The other men said nothing. Dorothy said nothing, because as far as Dorothy was concerned, there was nothing to say. She had guests. The officers had checked. Everything was exactly as it should be. The man across the street, watching from his window as the patrol car pulled away, turned back to the Facebook group. And while he posted, and while the comments multiplied, and while the neighborhood constructed its narrative with the efficient, self-reinforcing energy of a community that has already decided what it is afraid of, in Dorothy's kitchen, she was teaching Rudy how to make cornbread. He didn't know how. He'd told her he'd never made it, had only eaten it, and she'd looked at him the way she looked at things that needed fixing and said, "Well, tonight you're learning." And she'd handed him the mixing bowl. He was careful with it, the way he'd been careful with the mugs. Like a man who understood that things that belonged to other people deserved a certain kind of attention. Dorothy noticed this. She always noticed these things. The storm outside was building. The wind was picking up. The snow was coming down in the dense, directional way that meant it had no intention of stopping soon. The power, which had been flickering on and off for the past hour in that warning way that power has before it makes its final decision, went out at 9:43 in the evening. The living room went dark. And Dorothy, without particular alarm, without anything more dramatic than the small, capable sigh of a woman encountering a thing she has encountered before and knows exactly how to handle, went to the drawer in the kitchen where she kept the candles and began to light them. "I keep them for just such an occasion," she said, to nobody in particular, or perhaps to all of them, and she moved through the rooms and set candles in holders and on saucers and on the edges of the mantel beside Harold's photograph, and the darkness became warm and flickering and close, and the living room, which had been a room with 15 unexpected guests in it, became something else. Became, in the particular alchemy of candlelight and warmth and a storm pressing its enormous weight against the windows, a shelter. An actual shelter. The distinction is important. A room is where you are. A shelter is where you have been brought in from the cold. They talked. The stories that came out in that candlelight were not the stories of that evening, not the incident and the road and the storm. They were older stories, personal stories, the kind that emerge when the circumstances have stripped away whatever performance a person normally brings to an encounter with strangers. Walt talked about his father, not about the war, but about the man after the war, the particular specific difficulty of knowing someone who had been shaped by something you hadn't seen. Several of the others, listening, nodded in a way that meant they understood this from the inside. Rudy talked about where he'd grown up. Dorothy talked about the town, not the town as it was now, but the town as it had been when she and Harold were young, when the diner was run by a woman named Evelyn who made pie that people drove 30 miles for, and the church marquee had all its letters, and the street they were sitting on was all young families and summers that lasted and didn't seem to. Nobody performed anything. Nobody managed anything. They just talked, in the way that people will sometimes talk when the power is out and the candles are lit and the storm is pressing close and everything that usually fills the space between strangers has been quietly removed. At some point past midnight, past 2 in the morning, perhaps, or past 3, Vince slipped out of the living room into the hallway. The others didn't notice or noticed and said nothing, which with this group amounted to the same thing. He was on his phone for a long time, making calls, not to chapters, or not only to chapters, to other people, following the thing that had been turning over in him since Dorothy had spoken about Harold's unit, since the dates had aligned in a way that could not be coincidence and could not be ignored. He made his calls, and then he came back to the living room and said nothing about it. Dorothy had fallen asleep in her chair. It had happened gradually, the way sleep takes people who have been warm and still and in the company of voices they have grown comfortable with. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow, dignified relinquishment, her head settling against the wing of the chair, her hands still folded in her lap. Vince stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the couch. He picked up the blanket from the back of it. The old quilted one, the one that had clearly been on that couch for decades, faded and soft, and carrying the particular smell of a house that has been loved in for a long time. And he draped it over Dorothy, carefully, not waking her. Nobody in the room said anything about this. Nobody had to. When the sun came up, the storm was over. The world outside Dorothy's windows was white and clean and absolutely still in the way that the world after a serious snowstorm is still. A stillness that feels less like absence and more like held breath, like the world is pausing to take stock of what it has done. The sky had cleared to the particular pale blue of a winter morning after weather, cold and bright, and seeming almost apologetic. The men had been up before dawn, quietly, with the practiced efficiency of people who have long experience of early departures. They had packed their things, straightened the room, washed the dishes. Every dish, the mugs and the bowls and the pot from the soup, folded the blankets, swept the kitchen floor with the broom that had been standing in the corner. The house, when they were done, was cleaner than they had found it. On the kitchen counter, they left money. More money than Dorothy would ever accept, stacked under the empty coffee mug in the particular apologetic way of people who know that the gesture falls short of what they actually feel, but cannot identify what would fall less short. And on the kitchen table, they left a note. A single folded piece of paper. Dorothy would read it. But not yet. The engines started, one by one, in the pale morning, and the convoy moved slowly through the quiet snow-covered street, past the houses with their drawn curtains, past the man across the street who was an early riser and had come to his window at the sound and watched, expressionless, as they went. And then they were gone. And Dorothy's street was quiet again. She woke in her chair a little after 7. The first thing she saw was the light. The winter morning light, pale and clean, coming in at the angle that meant the storm had passed. She sat for a moment in the half-awareness of waking, aware of the particular quality of the silence, aware that something had been different about the night, and not quite, for one suspended moment, able to reconstruct exactly what. Then she remembered. She sat with it for a moment. Sat with the memory of the evening, the candlelight and the stories and the sound of men's voices in a house that had held only one voice for a long time. And she felt something that she would have had difficulty articulating, something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but occupied the particular territory between them that only certain kinds of unexpected grace can reach. She stood. She folded the blanket, her blanket, back from wherever it had migrated to in the night. And she noticed that it had been on her, and she understood who had put it there, and she stood with that understanding for a moment before she put the blanket back on the couch. The kitchen was immaculate. She stood in the doorway of it and looked at the clean counter and the washed dishes and the swept floor and the money under the mug and the folded note on the table, and she felt, very quietly, like crying. Not from sadness, but from the particular species of being moved that has no other outlet. She picked up the note. She read it. She set it back down on the table. She made her coffee. She went to the window. She looked out at the white morning, at her street returned to its ordinary self, at the cardinal who had come back to the feeder on the left despite the snow, and was sitting there in the way that cardinal always sat, like a small red argument against the idea that anything had fundamentally changed. She thought the story was over. She was wrong. She heard it before she saw it. She was still at the kitchen window, second cup of coffee in hand, when the sound started. Far away at first. So far that it could have been anything. Could have been a truck on the highway a mile distant. Could have been the kind of road noise that drifts on cold, clear air and plays tricks. But it grew, steadily, with a direction to it, a vector, something that was not drifting but approaching. Something that was coming here, specifically and intentionally, with the full commitment of a sound that knows exactly where it is going. Her coffee mug vibrated, very slightly, on the counter. Then her windows began to rattle. Dorothy set down her mug. She walked to the front door, and she opened it. She would describe this moment later, to her daughter, to the neighbor across the street who came to her eventually, hat in hand, to anyone who asked in the months that followed, as the moment when she understood something she had always believed but never had proven to her so completely and so enormously. The street was full of motorcycles. Not 15, not even close to 15. They were coming from both ends of the street. No, from beyond the street, from the roads that fed into it, from further than she could see, the sound of them arriving before they did, a great rolling thunder of engines that seemed to fill the entire sky. Men and women, all of them in leather, all of them with the insignia she recognized from the night before, chapter patches from across 3 states, from places that were not here and had not been here, but were here now. They filled the street. They overflowed the curbs. They kept coming. 100 motorcycles, perhaps more. The number would be talked about for a long time afterward and never quite settled, because by the time they were all there, the street had ceased to be a street and had become something else. A gathering, a deliberate human assembly, a thing that had been organized in the cold hours of the early morning by a man named Vince who had made calls from a hallway while an old woman slept in a chair, and those calls had moved through a network of people connected by roads and shared miles and the particular fierce loyalty of those who ride, and by morning they had all come. The message Vince had sent was simple. He had said, "There's a woman who showed us what it means to be human. We're going back." And they had come. Dorothy stood on her porch in her housecoat. In the pale February morning, at the center of a sea of chrome and color and engine sound that was the most unexpected thing she had seen in 73 years of encountering unexpected things. And she put her hand over her mouth, not from fear. From the only gesture that was adequate to the moment, which was no gesture at all, which was just a hand over a mouth and eyes that were doing something that eyes do when the thing in front of them exceeds the capacity of the face to contain it. The engines cut, one by one. The silence came back. And in the silence, one man dismounted and walked to her porch. Vince, road-worn, 6'2", frost in his beard again from the morning ride. He was carrying something in his hand. He stood at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her. And she looked down at him. And there was a moment between them that was almost without language, not uncomfortable, not searching, just present, just 2 people in the cold morning air with something between them that had not been there yesterday. He said he had made some calls. Not to chapters, well, to chapters too, but to other people first, to a veterans organization, to a regimental historian whose number he had eventually found, through a chain of contacts, at 2 in the morning while Dorothy slept and the candle burned low on the mantel beside Harold's photograph. He said he needed to be sure before he said anything. He'd needed to check the dates and the unit and the region and the particular action that Dorothy had described, imprecisely but accurately enough, over Harold's photographs in the candlelight. He needed to be sure because the alternative was saying something to this woman that wasn't true, and he was not willing to do that. Dorothy listened. She stood on her porch steps in her housecoat in the February morning, surrounded by more motorcycles than she had ever seen in one place, and she listened to Vince. Harold's unit, he said. In the winter of 1950, there had been a group of civilians. A family, displaced by the fighting, caught on a road that had become dangerous with the advance of the front. The unit had stopped. They had stopped, in the middle of conditions that did not encourage stopping, and they had helped, had given them food, had escorted them to safety, had spent time they arguably did not have on people they had no obligation to. It had been recorded, not widely. It was not the kind of thing that made it into the major accounts, the kind of thing that histories put in their chapters. It was the kind of thing that gets written into regimental records and then sits there for 70 years, known to almost nobody. Vince's great-uncle had been in that group of civilians. Dorothy heard this, and she did not immediately understand. The information arrived in pieces, the way information sometimes does when it is large, when the brain needs to process each part separately before it can assemble them into the whole. She heard the unit. She heard the winter of 1950. She heard the civilians on the road. She heard the young soldiers who stopped when they didn't have to. And then she heard Vince's great-uncle. And she understood. She sat down on her porch steps. She sat down on the cold stone of her porch steps in February, in her housecoat, surrounded by 100 motorcycles and the men and women who had ridden them here, and she put both hands over her face, and she sat there for a moment in which the present and the past collapsed together into something that had no name and didn't need one. Vince sat down beside her. He had something in his hand. A printout, the regimental record, blurry from being photographed on a phone at 2 in the morning and printed somewhere along the way. He handed it to her. She looked at it. She couldn't read it clearly, because her eyes were not cooperating, but she held it. She held the paper in her hands like it was the thing itself, like the paper was the 70-year-old act of kindness made present and tangible and returnable. Vince said, quietly, in the voice of a man who does not speak softly very often and is doing so now because the moment requires it. Your husband helped my uncle survive. I didn't know it until last night. I thought you should. Dorothy looked at Harold, saying, the one she had carried for 47 years. A closed door is a closed heart. Harold had opened a door in the winter of 1950, on a road in Korea, to a group of strangers who needed what he had. He had done it without expectation of return, without any possibility of knowing what ripples it would send, what distances they would travel, what door they would eventually come back around and knock on. They had come back. 70 years later, on a February morning in a quiet American town, they had come back. The neighbors were on their porches. All of them. The whole street, drawn out by the sound of 100 engines arriving and then going silent, standing in their doorways or on their front steps in their winter coats, looking at a thing they had not expected to see. A street full of motorcycles and the people who rode them, and not a single act of trouble in any direction. Just people, getting off their bikes, moving toward Dorothy's house with tools and groceries and firewood from a truck that had followed the convoy. The fence at the edge of Dorothy's property had been leaning since October. Nobody had gotten to it. 3 of the men assessed it in the way that people who know how to fix things assess things that need fixing, briefly, practically, without drama, and then they fixed it. Split rail. Straight and solid and standing in the snow where it had been leaning. The firewood situation was addressed. The gutters, which had accumulated a winter's worth of ice and debris, were cleared. The walkway was shoveled, though the men had brought their own shovels. The groceries from the truck, bags of them, more than Dorothy could use in a month, were carried to the kitchen by Rudy and 2 others while Dorothy sat on her porch steps with a printout in her hands and Vince beside her. The neighbors watched all of this. And then, across the street, the man who had organized the Facebook group, who had called the police, who had posted into the night from his window while Dorothy taught Rudy to make cornbread, he came down off his porch. He crossed the street. He came to where Dorothy was sitting. He stood there for a moment with the particular discomfort of a man who is trying to locate the right words in a language he does not speak very fluently, which is the language of having been wrong about something in a way that was visible to other people. He said, I didn't understand. That was all. He said it simply, not with the performance of remorse, not with the language of a man who is building a case for his own goodness. Just, I didn't understand. And Dorothy, who was 73 years old and had been carrying Harold saying for 47 of those years, and who had just been handed a piece of paper that proved, in some complete and astonishing way, that her entire life had been right, looked at the man across the street with the same expression she might have offered to Rudy when he said he didn't know how to make cornbread. She said, most people don't. That's what doors are for. Later. Much later, after the men and women had ridden away in a long, slow, deliberate convoy that the whole street came out to watch, after the groceries had been put away and the firewood was stacked and the fence stood straight in the thin winter light, Dorothy sat in her kitchen. She picked up the note from the kitchen table, the one they had left before dawn, under the coffee mug, that she had read once in the morning and set back down. She read it again. It said, Ma'am, we don't know how to thank you properly, so we're going to try anyway. What you did last night wasn't nothing. For a lot of us, it was everything. The brothers. She sat with those words for a long time. A closed door is a closed heart. Harold had known it in 1950, on a road in Korea, when he'd stopped for strangers in conditions that did not encourage stopping. Dorothy had known it in the 47 years since, carrying the saying like a river stone, smooth and warm and solid. 15 men had walked through her door in a blizzard and found out that it was true, and they had carried it home. And 100 more had ridden through a February morning to tell her so. The note went back on the kitchen table. Dorothy got up and made a fresh pot of coffee. Because that is what you do. There is something this story is about that is not exactly about motorcycles, and not exactly about blizzards, and not exactly about the specific geography of a small American town that had an unspoken rule it needed to revise. It is about what we cost ourselves when we close the door before we know what is on the other side of it. About the particular kind of small that fear makes us. Not small in a temporary way, not small in a way that passes, but small in the deep, structural way of a life that has slowly sealed itself against surprise and become, as a result, less than it was. Safe, predictable, unmoved. Dorothy was not safe. Not in the way people mean when they say it. She was something older than safe. She was brave in the way that quiet people are sometimes brave. Without audience, without performance, without any particular awareness that what she was doing was anything other than the ordinary expression of who she had always been. She was the generation that remembers when you didn't need to audit a person's affiliations before you handed them a cup of coffee in the cold. The generation that understood, in the bone, that the distance between strangers is mostly made of things we could choose not to believe about each other. That kindness. Real kindness. The kind that costs something. The kind that opens the door when common sense says to lock it, does not diminish the person who gives it. It completes them. Harold knew it. Vince, eventually, came to know it. Rudy is probably still learning it, the way young people learn things that are worth learning, slowly, imperfectly, through the accumulation of moments that are better than they expected. And the man across the street, I didn't understand, maybe learning it still. Maybe standing at his window on winter evenings and looking at Dorothy's house with something different in his chest than what was there before. Maybe, in the private and unhurried way that genuine reconsideration happens, becoming slightly larger than he was. That is all any of us can do, really. Become slightly larger. Open one more door than we thought we could. Dorothy did that. And in doing it, she opened something in 15 men. And they opened something in 100 more. And 100 more drove 3 states to come back and say so. Dorothy still lives in that house. The fence they fixed that February morning is still standing. Straight and solid and untroubled by the seasons that have come and gone around it. And every February, without fail, she puts an extra pot of coffee on. Just in case. If you're still here, and I mean really still here, all the way to the end of Dorothy's story, then you already know something that a lot of people scroll past too fast to find. You understand that the best stories aren't about extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. They're about ordinary people doing what they've always known is right, even when nobody told them to, even when the world outside their window said not to. Dorothy is that. Harold was that. And in the end, so was Vince, and so was Walt, and so was Rudy with his careful hands and his willingness to learn to make cornbread. If that's the kind of story you want more of on this channel, subscribe. Not for the algorithm. Not for any number. For Dorothy. For Harold. For every person who has ever opened a door when the comfortable thing, the easy thing, the thing that made the most conventional sense, was to keep it closed. And if you believe that the people who posted in that neighborhood Facebook group, the people who called a woman's judgment into question for choosing to see the human being rather than the patches on the leather, owe Dorothy more than a quiet apology on a February morning, then comment below. Open the door. I want to see how many of us are standing on her side. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that people can still surprise you. That kindness still moves through the world, across decades, across distances, across every imaginable divide. That a door opened in 1950 on a road in Korea can come back around, 70 years later, in the form of 100 bikes on a quiet snow-covered street. It can. It does. Dorothy proved it. And Harold, I think, always knew it would.